Okay, so today we're moving on to the next unit, and this next unit is outside of the programming aspect of the course to a degree, and we're going to be talking about the internal hardware of a computer, mostly internal anyway, and all the important aspects of that. And there's going to be a lot of different pieces to this lesson, so I'm going to try and break the video up into a few different parts, otherwise it'll get a little long and not be very entertaining. So we don't need to talk about every single part of a computer. There are a lot of different components inside of a computer. We're just going to look at the key ones and what I deem to be the key components of a computer that really give it what we call power or speed. That depends on the individual component and how they work well together. So we're going to look at 5 different parts. We're going to look at the motherboard, the central processing unit, the hard disk drive, random access memory, and the graphics card. And you'll notice that beside each one of these names here, we have a little short form acronym. Now, I'll be honest with you, this is what is known as in short context, but to be honest, a lot of these ones we never actually use. Like, nobody ever calls their motherboard a MOBO. Nobody ever calls their graphics card a GPU typically. The other 3 are pretty standard though. Well, maybe not even the HDD. But anyways, let's move on. So we're going to start off with the motherboard. Now, I want you to be able to identify what these components look like by their picture. If you're to ever go build your own computer, or if you're looking to get support on things, it's important that you understand what all these different aspects are. And you can see this motherboard here, this is going to be the central focus of things. Now, just to help guide your notes while we're going through this, if you go onto our Google Classroom, there is a big ideas sheet that you can print out. Pause what we're doing right now, go print that out and follow along with that. And that'll help guide your notes that we're taking today. And what you're going to see in there is it's going to ask you all the information that I'm about to discuss about each one of these components. Sorry about jumping around like that, but just recalled. Anyways, so going back to this, we see on the side here, we have our motherboard, and this is where we're going to be slotting in all the other components because they're all going to plug into this thing. And what we're going to do is I'm going to try and explain where all the pieces come in. But ever since computers first began, people have been trying to find a good analogy for a computer, and the best analogy that we've seen is the analogy to the human body. Each of these components in the computer that we're going to look at are very analogous to something that we have in our body. So for example, the motherboard, this is very similar to our spine or our central nervous system. And what that means is basically everything in our body is connected to this central nervous system. And same thing in a computer. Everything in a computer is connected to this motherboard. And it's what kind of links everything together. It's the way we send messages in our body, it's the same way that we send messages in a computer. So it acts as the focus point that all hardware is going to connect to so they can communicate with one another using each other's functionality. There's no direct connection to, say, for example, from your keyboard to your monitor. So when you type a letter on your keyboard in Microsoft Word or something like that, it goes through a whole chain of interactions inside the computer before you ever see that letter appear on the screen. And it all kind of routes through this motherboard to some degree or another, in many ways usually. So how does it actually do this? Well, using either circuits or cables, each device is going to connect to the motherboard. Now, when we talk about connecting to the motherboard, we use 2 terms, direct connection and indirect connection. A direct connection means that the part itself is actually plugged directly into the board, and that reduces travel time for information. So if there's no cable that it's got to run through, it goes directly into the hardware. Great. An indirect connection is when we connect a device through a cable of some kind. Now, depending on what causes a certain product to be fast or slow, that may be okay to use an indirect connection versus a direct connection. We're going to go into more detail on that in a little bit. But so you just know that there are some devices that we're going to talk about that are going to be directly connected to the motherboard, and they'll slot in places like this, and these spots over here, and this big one right here. Each one kind of connects to a different, very important component. And then there's indirect connections, and the indirect connections are going to plug into cables, and those cables are typically going to plug into various places, usually around here and whatnot. If I'm looking at this image properly, it's kind of small and fuzzy. Moving on. So where is this motherboard actually located inside of our computer? Well, it is an internal component, which means it's inside the computer. And more aptly, it's actually connected directly to the case itself. So this is kind of like the heart of everything. So everything needs to link to it, so it needs to be stable. So since everything's going to be attached to it, we're going to connect it directly to the computer case itself. All right. So let's pause there. We'll move on. In the next video, we're going to get into the central processing unit, which is going to discuss in more detail on how the CPU works.